over a month before the Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng term of office ends. The President has yet to indicate who he's going to nominate as the new Chief Justice. Under the system as it's been over the last 10 years or so, maybe a bit longer, the President nominates their candidate for Chief Justice. The Judicial Service Commission has then interviewed that person. But there also calls for a more democratic system to be used this time around, perhaps with more candidates. Chris Oxtoby is a senior researcher at the Democratic Governance and Human Rights Unit at the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. You could say that he watches judges and our judiciary for a living. Chris, good afternoon to you, and thanks very much indeed for your time. I mean, time seems to be running out. You would have thought by now, perhaps, the President would have made a nomination.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you for having me on again. Yes, one would. The clock is very much ticking. As you say, the normal process, or the minimum process that the Constitution requires, would mean that a potential candidate or candidates would be interviewed by the JSC. And there also has to be consultation with members of the political parties represented in Parliament. And now that we've had the announcement that Parliament's rising on Friday, that presumably is only going to complicate the process. So the clock really is ticking on this. And it's certainly not a great situation to have that leadership gap at the head of the judiciary not being filled as quickly as possible.
Is there any sign yet that the President is listening to all of this, that he is preparing to act, to make a nomination? I mean, could I call you back in an hour and say, well, now we know who it is?
Steve, officially, I've seen no indication that the presidency must be thinking on it, and they must be working on it, just because of the gravity of the position and the short time frame that you've alluded to. I've seen reports in the media over the weekend suggesting some potential names that have been considered, but I'm not aware that anything has formally been announced or put into progress by the presidency as yet.
What happens if Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng's term actually expires? I mean, it can't just be extended, can it? So what happens then?
No, you're quite right. It can't be extended. So it's a hard stop on I think it's the 11th of October. What will almost certainly then happen is that the Deputy Chief Justice would just fill that position, probably be formally appointed as the acting Chief Justice. So that's permissible legally. I don't think it's an ideal situation at all. I think we tend to over-rely on acting positions, which of course by their nature don't have the permanency and security of tenure that a permanent position does. And I think it makes it very difficult for someone who's acting in a leadership position to really try and undertake any meaningful reforms if they may not be there past the next month. But I think as a stopgap measure, if the position is indeed vacant when we hit the 11th of October, that will be what will happen, and we'll probably have acting Chief Justice Zondo in place until the permanent appointment is made.
You could argue that there's quite a lot on the Deputy Chief Justice's plate already. He's got a Zondo Commission report to write.
Well, he does, and this just illustrates one of the problems with relying on an acting position to plug the gap. And indeed, he does have an awful lot on his plate, and perhaps the situation may then arise where someone else from the Constitutional Court is appointed as an acting Deputy Chief Justice and helps out with the workload. But I mean, it's a very unsatisfactory situation to be in. Whether there is even time now for the presidency to get that appointment made, I'm not sure. I would think it's cutting it so fine that it may not even be possible. But at the very worst, I would think the sooner it's done, and so the shorter period of time anyone has to act in that position, the better it would be.
So if the system that's been used in the last 2 or 3 times is used again, in other words, the President makes a nomination, the Judicial Service Commission has a hearing. Now, the Chief Justice is the chair of the Judicial Service Commission. So, I don't know, does that mean that Chief Justice Mogoeng, if it happens before the end of his term, would he chair it? If it happens after his term, who would chair the Judicial Service Commission hearing? I mean, this is where things start to get a little complicated.
Well, they get particularly complicated because of we've just been discussing Deputy Chief Justice Zondo's position, and he would. Your normal practice would be the Chief Justice is not available or not able to chair the JSC, that the Deputy Chief Justice, by rule, steps in to fill that position. And that's a very tricky position as far as the current Deputy Chief Justice is concerned, because either one, he may be a candidate himself, in which case he quite obviously cannot chair it. And in that case, I suppose an acting Chief Justice or Deputy Chief Justice would have to be in place to chair it. Or if he's not a candidate, then we could be in a somewhat awkward situation where someone who many people would regard as a frontrunner is not being put forward and will be interviewing people who will be about to become his boss. So it's really not a very satisfactory position. I think it would have been much better if we'd been in a situation where this had been done before the current Chief Justice left his position, so he could have chaired it, and there would have been no confusion or uncertainty about that position. But my understanding is that his long leave is not going to see him doing any further official duties between now and the end of his tenure. So we're going to have to come up with another solution along the lines I've mentioned, which is going to be quite awkward, to put it simply, whatever happens.
Well, anyone who's not convinced of how awkward it is, I suppose, could go back 10 years and watch what happened when then Deputy Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng chaired the interview with the then candidate, who's now Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng.
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, it's a particularly... That had been such a contentious appointment of Mogoeng Mogoeng as Chief Justice, and it had the particularly unfortunate combination of those who were most opposed to his appointment would probably have preferred the then DCJ Moseneke to have been the Chief Justice instead, and DCJ Moseneke then chairing the interview, which became quite fraught and acrimonious at times, was not a good look for the judiciary. I mean, look, we do have to rigorously scrutinize candidates for this position. Obviously, it's a very important position, but it would certainly be nice if we don't have to go back down the road of 10 years ago again.
There's a huge amount going on around our judiciary at the moment, and this, frankly, I think is a consequence of what's happening in our society and primarily what's happening in our politics. We see that more and more political cases come before judges. As a result, they have to make decisions in disputes. As a result of that, people cast aspersions against them, and the legitimacy of the entire system, both the politicians and the judiciary, I'd argue, gets affected by this. There's an Afrobarometer survey which came out a couple of weeks ago, which really illustrates this quite starkly. How difficult is the job of Chief Justice in South Africa right now, 2021, September?
It's exceptionally difficult. It really requires, I think in some writing about it, we've described as almost a superhuman role, because you have the context that you allude to, where the judiciary, as you say, gets drawn into highly contested, politicized issues. They get unavoidably drawn into that because the Constitution gives the courts extensive powers, and people bring those disputes to the courts. So there's really not much the courts can do to mitigate that. They have to decide the cases that are brought before them. So you have a Chief Justice who has to be almost I don't want to say has to be a politician, because that has the wrong connotations, but the Chief Justice has to be savvy enough and switched on to their context to help the judiciary navigate those circumstances. I think they have to be a very strong jurist, so they have to be a deep thinker about the law who's capable of leading on the development of our law. And they also, I would argue, have to be a very strong administrator, because the judiciary has taken on more and more of its administrative functions that used to be housed in the Department of Justice. The judiciary now runs itself through the Office of the Chief Justice. And so the Chief Justice, as the head of the judiciary, has to have some considerable administrative skills, I would argue, to make sure that all runs smoothly. And on top of all of that, just has to, head the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the country, has to chair the JSC, has to act as effectively a diplomat for South Africa in international judicial forums. So it's a really, really challenging job, for sure.
Chris Oxtoby, thank you. Senior Researcher, Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town.